Hey, this is Josh Keaton, and you are listening to the Geekcast Radio Network.
Hello and welcome to the Comic Concierge Podcast, a podcast that believes that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Today is another one of my concierge episodes where I bring someone on, I recommend a book to them, and we discuss it. This is actually a continuation episode, as back again to discuss Royal City is J. Duran from In Session Film. Welcome back, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. I am super glad to be here, and boy, do I have thoughts on the comic you recommended for me.
Good to hear, good to hear. Yes, this is our second time discussing Royal City. We talked about Volume 1 a few months ago. I will put that in the show notes so people can check that out. I would highly advise checking that out and before getting into this. But before we get into actual Royal City, JD, because I know we talked about your comic book history last time, but before we get into Royal City, why don't you discuss your podcast, In Session Film, and what you guys are all about?
Yeah, so over at In Session Film, we talk movies, of course, and we have two versions of the show. On our main show, we talk about, the new releases, typically your bigger releases, a la your, your solos, your Deadpools, your Ocean's 8s. And we have top 3 lists and other fun banter for that show. And then we have our extra film podcast on Fridays, which is dedicated to your indie films, your art house films, or classics that we just don't have time for on our main show. So we do our best to, cover a nice little range there, because we're equally as interested in the Moonlights of the world as we are, the Infinity Wars, if you will. So,
yeah, you guys definitely cover a lot and great discussion. It's to me one of the best and most consistent film podcast out there. So
yeah, I appreciate
highly recommend it. So you guys always have great discussion no matter what you're talking about. So definitely
appreciate it. Yeah.
So we're talking about Royal City because listening to your podcast and knowing your sensibilities, like I mentioned last time, I know you're big into especially stories that involve father and son dynamics and family dynamics. And we last volume we definitely got into that, but this volume is a little bit different. We actually go back in time and focus mostly on Tommy. We obviously know what happens to him in Volume 1, as his death is the major element that is hovering over the book, literally and figuratively. Now, looking at Volume 2, how did this work for you compared to Volume 1?
Oh boy, Dan. I was very, very much moved by this comic, and a lot of it comes down to what you're saying in Volume 1. And I do think the two are very intimately tethered together. I don't think Volume 2 carries as much weight if you haven't read Volume 1. But going into this, having experienced Volume 1 and, the characters of Richie and Tara and Patrick, they are very much haunted by Tommy's death, as you were talking about. And I do think there's a lot of potency to that. And in this version, we get more perspective from Tommy before he died and what his life was like. And we come to find out that he is experiencing some physical pain. He's having these massive headaches and migraines that he just can't escape from. And on top of that, it's coupled with this depression, or this, he's just, miserable. He wants to get out of Royal City. He wants to have this life. But he's not exactly sure how to escape, Royal City. He's not exactly sure how to escape this melancholic feel that he is carrying with him. And so, he just feels like he is anchored down, and he's not exactly sure where to go. And there's so much about the exploration of that by Jeff Lemire that I find so poignant, and visceral and human. And I love how that connects back to Richie and Tara and Patrick, the younger versions of them, and, and how we see them interact with Tommy when he's alive. There's so much concise writing and storytelling from Jeff Lemire that makes not just a cohesive story, regarding this specific flashback that we're, witnessing, but it gives a lot more weight, I think, to volume 1 when you see, where these characters are and why they are haunted by Tommy's death. There's so much that volume 2 gives to that, with those specific characters that I quite love. But with Tommy specifically, there's so much going on with him that I was moved by, especially issue 7. I sent you a text earlier today. Issue 7 and issue 10 wrecked me. Both of those issues just emotionally destroyed me for reasons I'm sure we'll get into. As I'm rambling on here, I'm saying a lot of words to say I quite love this, even though at the end of the day, I'm probably as depressed now as Tommy was in this comic. So
yeah, we were talking beforehand. I'm like, next time we get you on, I got to get you more of a cheerful book, because this is not
dour. It is very dour. Yeah.
And I think you make a good point about how this definitely informs the first volume, and I agree that I think it probably wouldn't have as much weight without that, but obviously that's the way that the story is told. And it's just interesting reading this volume and just seeing the relationship, all these, all the brothers and sisters, Richie and Patrick, and what their relationship to Tommy, and just thinking back into the way they envision him currently. Especially the one that really caught my eye was Richie, because it was interesting going back and seeing the way they interact within this volume, because, considering the fact that he sees him as a reflection of himself, he sees him as like very much an extension of who he is. I went into this thinking, okay, well, their history must be that they were very tight, that they had a strong bond, but that is not the case.
Yeah, case.
They're very distant from one another. And so I'm just, that to me then leaves the door open to where exactly is that coming from? Because obviously the mother, you see why she feels the way she does. She does have such that motherly quality to her. She is very much looking out for him. But some of the other characters, they're especially Richie, as I mentioned, it just seems like his point of view seems to be swayed based upon past reflection. And I don't know if that's, obviously we still have a little bit more story here. But I found that one of the most intriguing aspects of this volume.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to see where Richie goes, at least in volume 1 anyway, comparatively to volume 2. But there's so much about volume 1 that makes more sense as to why Richie responds the way he does, why he is the way he is, given the events that unfold here in volume 2. And it's heart-wrenching where this goes for me. It's really heartbreaking, and I think Lemire does a great job of not only rendering a reflection of Richie and his relationship with Tommy, but Tara as well, the sister character, I think has a smaller role here but a significant one, and Patrick as well, given that he's a writer, and there's parallels between Tommy and Patrick in that regard as well. And the fact that all three siblings, speaking of Richie, Tara, and Patrick, they end up at the same place at the same time at a pretty pivotal event. And the way Lemire builds to that, it's actually handled with subtlety, and perhaps it's a little bit obvious, but I think that obviousness is crucial, at least for me, given the fact that all three of them have been haunted similarly, and given the symbolism here. And we talked about the symbolism in quite heavily in volume 1. And I think volume 2, while it doesn't have the same kind of symbolism regarding Tommy being this haunting figure, it does make sense of why all three of them become, equally as haunted, but perhaps in different ways. And it was pretty affecting for me.
Yeah, and you mentioned the haunting nature of it. And one thing that for me that felt like it was pertinent throughout, and it's even called out directly by Tommy at one point, is the loneliness, is the isolation that this resembles. You do get a lot of situations where rarely are characters in the same frame together. They're often always separated. Even when they are when they are together, rarely are they discussing or talking. One scene in particular that really spoke to me was with with Patrick and his dad going to work, and they're driving, and just three panels of them, and there's like no conversation. They're just yawning. There's just a lack of connection there, and I think that is kind of key throughout this, is that all these characters, for whatever reason, it's almost as if they were a family based upon happenstance. We get a little background of why their parents were married, and it's almost because of, it's almost like that they're, it was like, going to Back to the Future where the wrong family people get married. It's almost like that happened, and there's just no connection. And I just found that was really key to me. It was just like everything, there was just a loneliness and an aspect to it that, especially from Tommy's point of view, where just he's searching for that connection, and even he can't find it. And even if, like, when his family is together, there is just a barrier there for him.
No, I completely agree. There's this aura of loneliness and disconnect with the mom and dad characters that very much cast a spell among all of the children, and it does create this, this ambiance of dysfunction among this family. And I love the dramatic irony of that, given the title of this, Royal City, royal having this meaning of like high glamour, at least, that comes to mind, and this is anything but that. So I kind of, love that dramatic irony. But yeah, I think Lemire does a great job of not just offering this depressive state for the sake of it. I do think he's saying something fundamentally about how we react when we are in these depressive states that I find very provocative. And because this volume focuses heavily on Tommy and his story before he died, I want to spend a few moments on what moved me so much within that, because, you're right. You're talking about, Patrick and his loneliness, or, the familial loneliness that we see in all of these characters. But there's one moment that really spoke to me with Tommy, where he's talking about his parents and the fact that, they are, kind of lonely. Their marriage isn't necessarily, super strong or great by any means. But he says this line that rings so loud to me, where he says, "I don't want my mom or dad to get any smaller. I want them to see, I want them to seem big and grown up. I need them to, because the truth is, I'm really scared." Oh, that's a heart-wrenching line for me, when you realize, the emotional state of Tommy, the physical state of Tommy, the turmoil that he's experiencing, for his parents to, to revel in their own loneliness. It has this massive effect on this character that only becomes more. It just becomes more despondent as this story unfolds, and it's hard. It's just heartbreaking. I don't know what else to say about it, but I find it heartbreaking in a way that's, it's earned, and it's ultimately satisfying on a thematic level.
Yeah, and I agree. That certainly is a very poignant moment. Just seeing, obviously, this kid who is just legitimately the weight of the world in some ways is on his shoulders, even if it's not directly designed to be. But it just seems like he's just trying to do what he can to get by, and it just seems like everyone around, the lack of support isn't there. Though one of the moments that, like you mentioned, like moments that moved you, one of the moments that moved me was one of the few instances in which we do get that connection, and with his sister sitting on sitting on the rooftop, and then it just then it tied back to me the first volume, where you see her having such a motherly quality with him, and how you see glimpses of that here. They do seem to have some sort of connection, and just the honesty that's there. She's obviously going through a lot, and she wants to be reassuring, but she in her own right has a lot of things on her mind, but there is just that the one specific shot panel of them just slightly leaning in and just looking out into the world. It's like one of the few moments in which you saw two people connect, and that was like an image that just really stuck with me. And I think that's why there was it wasn't a beat down of sadness when we did get those moments of of glee or even somberness. It was effective, and I think that moment for me specifically, it was one of the biggest pieces of this volume that like tied everything together, that made this entire journey like worth it, because you see that there is caring here, even if it's not perfect.
I completely agree. There's another moment of connection that I really liked, and this also goes back to issue 7. The moment I was talking about before was also in issue 7, but this issue ends with a moment where Tommy is in the car with his mom, and this is after they visited the doctors. The doctors are, they suspect something is probably wrong, and they give him some medication to kind of help in the meantime till they get some more answers. And they're just in the car. There's actually 2 panels where, again, there's nothing talking, going back to what you were saying with Patrick and the dad moment. They're just there. And then his mom just leans over and calls out his name, Tommy. And he just says, yeah. And she simply says, I love you. And it kind of ends on this really beautiful moment of connection. These 2 characters that hardly interact in this issue, and after seeing all of this familial dysfunction and depression, you get this moment of hopefulness that I found quite riveting. And I think it's pretty clear. I mean, perhaps, you can tell me if you feel differently, but I think it's pretty clear with this volume. It's still bridging what another part of this story that's going to come. So there's going to be a volume 3, and I imagine that we'll see the mom, the dad, the siblings kind of respond to, the events of this and of course, volume 1. And I think you have to go to the extremes Lemire does here, given what he did in volume 1. And so there's something about the bleak nature of this volume, the fact that you get these little moments of connection here and there, which is great. I don't want it to get lost that, because we're talking a lot about how, this is a dour volume, and I don't want to dissuade people from reading it because of that, because I do think we're going to get to more of a hopeful resolution with these characters later on down the road. But I think you have to go to this territory, and I'm glad that Lemire never sways from that. I love that he sticks to those convictions. I think it makes for powerful storytelling.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And it's interesting you talk about, building to the next volume where there's more story here. And Lemire just recently indicated that there's going to be one more volume 3, and he's going to end it there. And he actually intended it to be more of an ongoing. He thought it would go longer, but in writing the story and moving it, he felt that he actually came to an end point that it found itself, so he didn't want to keep going. But so it's kind of the aspect of comic book storytelling, how it's a little bit different in the sense of, you can have it that your end point isn't always determined. You think you have an idea where you want to go, but eventually things change. And so I'm curious to see like how this all wraps up. But you do make a good point that obviously, we're talking about the emotional impact of this, but it is not like, like I mentioned, it's not just, it's not exploiting the sadness. It earns it. And I think ultimately, especially with that first volume, you do care about these characters. There's just a human quality to them. And it's through that human quality that, we do see this loneliness. And I think that opens up the ability for it to be such a relatable story. Because I think we've all had those situations where, we, especially, this taking place with most of these characters in high school, just getting out of college, where it's just that lack of direction that you're just trying to find, and how that can impact you. So I agree that there are moments in here where even if it's a connection that, we see connections that maybe aren't morally 100% correct in the sense of past loves coming up and the conversations that begin, but it just informs us about, it doesn't paint anyone out to be the villain, which I think I was concerned about with the first volume, but I think by this volume, we just see people for who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's an argument to be made that Richie comes out the worst, but I think you could argue that in volume 1 as well, though. I mean, there's just something about his personality that's different than everyone else's, but there's a consistency to it, and I respect that in Lemire's writing. And I think another reason this volume works, given its dour state, and not just the fact that we're going to build to something that will hopefully not be quite as bleak in volume 3. I think it does make sense to end after 3 volumes. But it's just the overall storytelling here is just so concise, and it has a purpose. Like, I don't think there's a wasted frame in this entire comic. I think he interweaves all of these characters, the 3 siblings. Tommy gets the most focus, but you got the 3 siblings, the 2 parent characters as well. So we are bouncing back and forth a lot, but there's something about the pacing of all of that, and just the timing of everything comes together that makes sense. So even though it certainly is an emotional story, I feel like the through lines of all of these threads coming together are very stirring and evocative in a way that is earned, like you were saying. So you still engage with these characters. You're still interested to see where it all goes. And honestly, with Tommy himself, given the fact that, we all know what happens to him physically, his arc here actually ends on a very beautiful note, on somewhat of an uplifting note. And I didn't expect that, but there's something kind of profound about that, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. In the sense of, it is building to that what we assume, or what we have learned, that eventual dread. And going into this volume, we knew where it ended up. We didn't know how or why, and we get some early hints, obviously, with his health concerns, and putting the pieces together, thinking of how we get there. Though I think the expediency into which it seems like we're getting there was quicker than expected. But you do make a good point to the sense of where you're thinking it would be building to this ultimate moment of just tragedy, in which it is there, but there is some sort of completion there. There is of that longingness is just at least put to aside for a moment, and making it almost making it not worthy, but worth this journey, because there is something tangible that occurs, and he isn't completely lost, even if it's just for that moment.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, even though, there's heavy foreshadowing going on for sure. I mean, you can see where this is going to go. I mean, and even without that foreshadowing, we all know that this is going to go, given what we know about Tommy in volume 1. But again, I think there's something about that storytelling that I find really striking in how it all works here. And I love that it kind of ends on this symbolic moment, like this thematic moment with Tommy, instead of relishing in the fact that, oh, here's this dreadful moment we all know that's coming. And Lemire kind of avoids all of that to, again, tap into something that is human, something that a lot of us can relate with. And given Tommy's arc and, this loneliness that he's feeling, for it to end on a note that is kind of the antithesis to that, I find really evocative. Like I said, I'm kind of curious what you thought of the artwork here. We talked about that in volume 1, and I quite loved it. I think it's obviously a very similar style. I feel like, I haven't read volume 1 since we talked about it last, but from my recollection, I feel like the artwork here is a little bit darker at times, darker colors, to kind of, represent the mood of this version. But overall, I still really love the artwork here. I'm curious what you thought.
Yeah, I really do. And I feel like with this volume, and it could just be me not misremembering, but I feel like when it comes to his panel layouts and stuff like that, he's playing with it a lot more.
For sure.
Like, and there's obviously a lot of the continuous motifs that we keep seeing with how music is often portrayed with that like wavy line, and also just like there's some really, I think, specific moments in this too, how it even like transitions to like legitimate like notebook design where which again just makes you realize that this perspective of this volume is coming from Tommy, even if he's not really within the story at the moment.
And I like the handwriting, like the actual like words on the page, mimics like handwriting. Yeah.
Yeah. I felt like, I know Lemire's style is not for everyone because it's got somewhat of a sketch-like quality to it, but it speaks to me, and I feel like the aesthetic of it fits with the story, specifically, and especially the watercoloring. There is the runniness to it in a way, like it's fitting. It fits with the mood of the book, and a lot of sometimes Lemire does black and white, which he did with Essex County, which is his first book. But I felt like with this, the coloring I think plays a huge role, especially as we're within these two periods, in the 90s and present day. I do think the color palette is a little bit different. It does have a darker texture to it, but also just stylistically, it's a little bit different. But I like how this takes place in the 90s, but it never feels like it's like pushing that too forward. You get some calls to the music of the time, but it's not like everyone's wearing grunge pants and the grunge pants, like those sort of things. Wearing classic 90 gear. It feels a little bit timeless in that sense. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the artwork, and I thought, like I mentioned, some of the panel choices, like there's a great moment with showing Tommy and again talking about the foreshadowing, him looking in the car in the early sense with Richie and his girlfriend, and he just gets this vision, I guess you would call it, with all the different versions of himself. So again, tying back to that,
I love that moment.
Yeah, tying back to the aspect of, is there some sort of supernatural element here? Is this, how does this tie back to the ghost like features that we've seen in the first one? But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the artwork, though. Like I mentioned, I know for some that like the more realistic piece, it may not work, but I enjoy it. I think, like you mentioned, with the storytelling, how it gets a lot out of a little. It's the same thing with Lemire. Like, he can get a lot of emotion out of a character with only a few lines.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The 90s aesthetic is certainly there for sure, and it parallels the dialogue at times in some interesting ways. The whole Nirvana's not going to be remembered in 20 years line, I thought was kind of funny. There is at least one moment of levity in the whole thing, but I love the artwork, and I love the varying, I guess, stylistic elements, because you were mentioning the moment, or there's a few moments, I guess, where it kind of mimics, notebook pad paper. There's also a couple of panels where it's just white with the character's kind of small, just kind of soaking in, I guess, this complete white background, which I thought was very interesting and kind of unique as well. So, and then there's a couple of, spurts where, Tommy is kind of in this dreamlike state. And, I kind of like how all of that is designed as well. And sometimes it's just, like the simplicity of it. Earlier you were mentioning this, this moment that Tommy has with his sister Tara, as they're just kind of sitting, on, part of the house, I guess. And there's something really stirring to me about it, where it's just, we're seeing them from behind, and Tara's just kind of resting her head on his shoulder, and they're just kind of looking out in the royal city. And there's nothing complex about the artwork there, but there's something about the simplicity of it. And how it kind of helps complement that moment on a dramatic level and an emotional level that I just find really evocative. So I love how Lemire is able to make, the complex moments work, the simple moments work. It just all comes together beautifully, I think.
Yeah, speaking of that, it's like, especially with the coloring there, because how their backs kind of intertwine and almost like come together near the touching of their heads. I think it really complements how they're relating to one another, and just the open space, how they're in the corner, where the sky is dominating that page, and it just that, I think that hopefulness comes because of that. It just, there's openness where much of it's been confined, right? We're confined in the factory, we're confined in these cars, where that was one of the few moments where you feel like there is an actual openness here. And it weirdly parallels when their mother's talking to her former boyfriend and on the lake. Again, it's one of the few times where it just seems like the world is open again. So I think that's a big piece of, you talked about simplicity. I think that's a good example of that, by just opening it up and not what's not said and what's not there speaks volumes.
Yeah, I completely agree. Another aspect to my experience that I want to mention, and this is sort of a side note. It doesn't directly, affect how anyone listening could, view this comic in terms of what it has to offer and its quality, but it was a major influence into my experience for it. And a lot of this played out naturally. Like, I didn't set out to do this intentionally, because I like to listen to music as everyone else does, but I wasn't listening to 90s bands, I guess, to get in the mood of this comic. But I listened to a lot of movie scores, as one can imagine, and we talk about movie scores often on our show. And randomly, as I'm reading this comic, the score that came on my Spotify list was Friday Night Lights, the movie, not the TV show. And a lot of that soundtrack was done by Explosions in the Sky. And if you're familiar with their work, you'll know that their music would probably complement the mood of this comic, as we've been talking about it quite well. And I didn't really catch it, honestly, until we were near the end. But I think there's something about listening to that soundtrack as I'm reading this that actually kind of put me into the right mood. So it was just kind of weird how, like, I guess divine interaction, I guess, kind of played a role into why I was so moved, because as that music is just kind of blaring in my ears and I'm reading this really emotionally stirring comic that's really well written and well constructed for the reasons we've been talking about, it was just perfect. So I guess I would recommend that if you want to read this. It certainly helps. Certainly, the comic works on its own very well, but it did make the experience for me, I think, more memorable. I think
that's interesting, because I think too, Jeff Lemire actually has like playlists that he creates that he recommends. I think there might be in Spotify or something like that that correspond with the book. But maybe that's on it. That's a good point. It does. I mean, that's the thing about comics. They don't have a score, but in a way, there's ways to portray music, and this does in some occasions. But yeah, I think I could certainly see how, like, it gives you that little extra oomph of emotional impact.
Yeah. So basically, that was a long spiel to say that movie scores can be effective, and that is because I wasn't even thinking about it. It just kind of something that happened. It was like, man, I'm finding myself really moved, and then I was like, oh, I'm kind of listening to this music that I think is helping a lot. So,
nice.
But it's also I don't want it to get lost that it's also the writing of Lemire's work here is what makes it more affecting than anything else. But I thought that was an interesting side note.
Yeah, very not serendipitous, maybe, I don't know the word for it, but very cool. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we bring this episode to a close?
No, I mean, really my only final thought on it is that I cannot recommend it enough. I mean, it is one of the most heart-wrenching things I've ever read, but it's equally as provocative and just so satisfying in every single way. So I found myself, quite emotional at the end of it. And it was interesting because, as soon as I finished, I usually like to do some like audio notes on my phone to just kind of, purge my feelings and just kind of try to articulate how I felt about it. And I struggled to do that exercise this time around. If I was to play those audio notes here on this show right now, it would be awfully embarrassing, to be honest with you, Dan, because I struggled. I mean, I broke down quite a few times doing those notes. I was a wreck after this. And I think a big reason why is because as a parent, and I'm sure you could feel the same, but I could, when I put, like if I exchange Tommy's name with my son's name, and then I see how this plays out, it speaks volumes to me as far as like how this situation could happen to anybody, right? and so then it affects like the way that I parent, and it affects the way that I look at my son, knowing that, you know, this is the last thing that I would want, you know, for my kid. And I think that just speaks to the quality and how engaged I was with this more than anything else. I view that as a good thing for this comic, that I was able to go to those lengths and grapple with this on such a deep emotional and personal level. And it just kind of affected my day. I mean, I immediately, you know, went home and, you know, grabbed my boy and gave him a big hug. And a lot of it just comes down to reading this piece of art that I think is really wonderful. So, you know, I can't recommend it enough. I mean, it is dour, it is bleak, but it's beautiful. I can't recommend it enough.
No, I'm very glad it definitely worked for you. And I agree. I think, you know, being a parent as myself, just the idea of the lack of control in that type of situation, putting in the shoes of seeing a sibling or loved one or a child like be forced with this, like, you know, ultimate horror of the unknown and what that could possibly mean. And
also, you know, we didn't talk about this a lot, but also the irresponsibility of everyone involved, right? I mean, because there are moments in this where people aren't sympathetic toward Tommy's situation. The fact that he's having these physical ailments, you know, they just kind of are like, oh, it's Tommy being Tommy. Like, this is how he's always been. And, you know, the parents are struggling with their own things. The siblings are, doing their own things. And so there's just a general lack of empathy and responsibility for Tommy, who was the youngest of this entire family. So then to see him, you know, to see his art crystallize the way it does, it just adds a level of, you know, as a parent, it's like, okay, I need to make sure that I don't fall into these traps. And I think this film does a great job of, you know, flashing the warning signs, if you will.
Yeah. And, you know, I was the youngest of 5 kids, so I completely kind of relate with Tommy, because I could see, you know, if your siblings are very quick to call out when they feel like you're just calling for attention. So I think that is, again, a very realistic piece of it. But irresponsibility is a good point, because even, you know, the father in this, who you know, at the beginning of the first volume, he is a central figure because he's the one that is dealing with some major ailments. And this, again, seeing he has some moments, you know, I do love the moment of when when Patrick determines he's actually gonna quit, and just the eventual smile that kind of gets around his face, just seeing that, like, okay, he's not going to go down the same path that I did. And that again, another small moment of hopefulness there and connection. But how often he purposely isolates himself, and, you know, how he finds sort of connection within, you know, his radio or just walking or I think if anything, he's probably the one character I felt like probably got left out the most. But I don't know if that's where we'll dive more in with the next volume.
I agree. I think we're going to see more of that. I assume we're going to see more of that in the next volume, because it certainly plants the seeds of, you know, where we see him in volume 1, like you're talking about. So, yeah, I mean, it should be interesting to see how, I guess, they, you know, Lemire kind of connects all of that. Yeah. But there's so much about this that I love.
Yeah, and I feel bad because I'm one issue ahead of you, because I've read the most recent issue, and I think the next volume will be complete within the next few months. So hopefully have you back on and do the trilogy, because that will definitely be great. But before we go, why don't you let everyone out there, if they want to follow you, learn more, hear more from you, how could they do that?
Yeah, so you can follow us on the social medias: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. At In Session Film, just search In Session Film, you'll find us. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. And you can find links to not just our social medias, but our podcasts, our reviews, everything is at our central hub at insessionfilm.com. And thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think definitely for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time to read it and talk about it. I know it was great having you on, and definitely have to do it again sometime. But if you want to communicate with this show, you can do so by I'm on Twitter at Movie Revolt. The show's on Facebook and Instagram. Just search Comic Concierge. You can also go to the website, Geekcast Radio or nerdly.co.uk, and leave a comment there. And if you would like, leave us a review on iTunes, because those are very helpful, especially for a newer podcast. But for now, again, I want to thank JD for joining me, and just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thanks for listening.